Jesus Christ was the King of the Jews, but he wasn't the only person of his day to have that title. When Jesus was born, the King of the Jews was Herod the Great, at least according to the Romans. This Herod tried to kill Jesus as an infant, but he's not the only Herod in the Bible. We continue to read about Herod's descendants in the Gospels and Acts. Who were these people, and what do we know about them? This is the story of the Herods, Judea's outrageous and deadly ruling family. Let's get into it. Howdy, folks. You can help me keep making this podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Herod the Great's family was not initially Jewish. They were from Idumea, or Edom, as it's called in the Old Testament. This is a land south of the Dead Sea, whose inhabitants were reckoned as descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. A little before 100 BC, the Maccabean leader John Hyrcanus conquered Idumea and forced the inhabitants to be circumcised and convert to Judaism if they wanted to stay in their land. That included a family which rose to prominence in Jewish society and eventually became the Herodian Dynasty. The Herods were thus Jewish by religion but Edomite by ancestry, a point that bred resentment among their Jewish subjects, and that resentment would contribute to the reputation the Herod family had for killing people. The man responsible for Herod's rise was his father, Antipas, or Antipater, to use the longer form of his name. Antipas the Idumean had become a key advisor to the Hasmonean rulers of Israel, who he played off against each other in order to gain influence for himself. He also courted favor with neighboring peoples, and more significantly, he courted favor with the Romans. When Julius Caesar was fighting in nearby Alexandria, Egypt, Antipas took troops there and defended Caesar, who made him a governor. Antipater then used this position to usurp the place of the Hasmonean dynasty, which had ruled Israel since the time of the Maccabees. Needless to say, Antipater made lots of enemies, and he was eventually poisoned by one of them. And so it goes. When Herod was a young man, his father appointed him governor of Galilee and his brother Faisal governor of Jerusalem. Herod immediately endeared himself to the Romans by capturing and executing a band of brigands that was preying on his territory. And so it goes. This did not endear him to the Jewish authorities, in part because only the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, was allowed to issue death sentences at the time. The Sanhedrin summoned young Herod before it, but instead of appearing in the customary black clothing, he strode into its chamber wearing purple with a group of bodyguards ready to defend him and carrying a letter of protection from the governor of Syria. Overawed, the council was afraid to do anything against Herod, but the president of the tribunal, Shemaiah, warned the others that they would regret their failure to take action against Herod. And they did. Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of Roman senators in 44 BC, and so it goes, leading to a period of civil war. Full stability would not be restored until Augustus Caesar became emperor in 27 BC. Herod exploited the period of instability by switching his allegiances whenever he needed to promote his own interests. At one point, Herod was forced to flee Judea by the last of the Hasmonean kings, Antigonus, who had been proclaimed king and high priest by the Parthians. Herod ended up in Rome, where the future Augustus and his rival, Mark Antony, pled Herod's case before the Senate. The body then proclaimed him king of the Jews. He returned to Judea and took possession of his kingdom by conquering it with the help of the Romans. Antigonus, the last king of the Maccabean line, was executed, and so it goes, and the Herodian Dynasty began. In some respects, Herod proved an able ruler. During his reign, Herod's kingdom prospered economically, which allowed him to raise the money needed to conduct extensive building projects. Constructing large and important public works was one of the ways that ancient rulers built a name and literally a legacy for themselves. Herod outdid many others in this respect, which is one of the reasons he's called the Great. He even conducted building projects in foreign lands to build his reputation abroad, but of course most of his building was done in Palestine. This included a series of lavish palaces for himself, but it also included many buildings for public use, including Hellenistic innovations like public baths, gymnasiums, and racetracks. To show his loyalty to his Roman patrons, Herod named many of the things he built after them. These included the Antonia Fortress in Jerusalem, named for Mark Antony, the Samaritan city Sebaste, for Augustus's Greek name, and the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, again for Caesar Augustus. The name of Augustus's longtime colleague Agrippa was even inscribed on one of the gates of the Jerusalem temple. Herod had also initiated a massive campaign to expand and beautify the Jerusalem temple, which was to be the most important of all of Herod's building projects. This project, carried out on Jerusalem's holiest site, and which would be expected to last for centuries, was meant to ensure Herod's immortality. The results were impressive. According to the Babylonian Talmud, there was a popular saying, "He who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building." One of Jesus' own disciples commented on this. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Far from becoming an immortal monument to the memory of Herod, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in AD 70, less than a century after Herod's death. As Herod's reign progressed, he became increasingly paranoid and unstable. There were indeed plots against him, and those around him manipulated his fears to their own advantage, leading him to lash out violently, including against members of his own family. Herod had a large number of people executed or assassinated, and so it goes, included not only many ordinary people, but also members of his broader family and even some of his own wives and sons. One of Herod's main wives was named Mariamne, and she was of Hasmonean origin. Herod married her, at least in part, to cement ties with the nation's former ruling family, even as his own family was displacing it. Herod professed to love Mariamne so much that on more than one occasion he gave orders for her to be killed if he himself died, so that he might not be separated from her in death. She, however, became convinced that he didn't really love her, and relations between them turned frosty. Eventually, Herod's sister convinced him that Mariamne was planning to poison him, and she was executed. And so it goes. Herod's own sons fared little better. Two of Mariamne's sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, had fractious relations with their father, who suspected them of plotting against him. Eventually, he brought them up on charges of treason before Augustus Caesar, who allowed Herod to convene a court to try them. The court found them guilty, and they were put to death by strangulation. And so it goes. And they weren't the last of Herod's sons to be killed off. Herod's firstborn son, Antipater, born of Herod's first wife, Doris, for many years was favored by Herod and heir to his throne. But he, too, was eventually brought up on charges of plotting against his father. He was executed just 5 days before Herod's own death. And so it goes. Herod thus killed 3 of his own sons. In view of such executions, the Emperor Augustus is depicted in Macrobius's work Saturnalia as quipping, "It is better to be Herod's pig than son." The joke being that since Herod was a Jew, he didn't eat pork, and so his pig would be safe. Against this background, it's easy to understand the account of Herod the Great in the Gospels. The Magi came from the east seeking the newborn king of the Jews. It was natural to seek such an infant in the court of the current king, Herod, and so they showed up there and asked, "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Since Herod had killed 3 of his own sons for plotting against him, you can imagine how this would have rung alarm bells. So it's no surprise that all Jerusalem would have been alarmed with him. Herod thus manipulated the Magi into finding the child for him, but when they failed to report back, he flew into a rage. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time he had ascertained from the wise men. And so it goes. Sometimes it's objected that we don't have an independent record of this event, but even absent that, the event is entirely in keeping with what we know of Herod's character and how he responded to perceived threats to his throne. Herod eventually survived all the perceived plots against him and died apparently of natural causes. What those were, however, is not entirely clear. He was felled by a mysterious disease that has proved difficult for modern medical experts to diagnose. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, there was a gentle fever upon him and an intolerable itching over all the surface of his body and continual pains in his colon, and dropsical tumors about his feet and an inflammation of the abdomen, and a putrefaction of his privy member that produced worms, besides which he had a difficulty of breathing upon him and could not breathe but when he sat upright, and had a convulsion of all his members. Modern specialists have proposed a wide range of diagnoses for this malady. One recent suggestion is kidney failure coupled with gangrene of the genitals. Herod sought various forms of treatment for this, but ultimately died, and so it goes. Needless to say, many of his subjects viewed this as a judgment from God and rejoiced at Herod's fall. The tyrant knew that there would be rejoicing at his death, and to prevent that from happening, he had many of the most eminent men in the land locked up in a hippodrome, a stadium for horse races, with orders that they should be killed as soon as he died, so that every family would mourn upon his passing. And so, for once it didn't go that way. His orders were not carried out. Although Herod had killed several of his sons, he didn't have all of them executed, and the survivors became the next generation of leaders in Judea. It was not a smooth transition. 3 of Herod's sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, ended up inheriting significant portions of his kingdom. Until shortly before his death, Herod's will named Antipas as his principal successor, but in the end he changed the will in favor of Archelaus. This set up a dispute in Herod's own family, with some favoring Archelaus, others favoring Antipas, and still others favoring the idea of direct Roman rule over Palestine. The matter was ultimately settled by the Emperor Augustus when the 3 brothers traveled to him for his decision. This trip forms part of the background to Jesus' parable of the minas, in which a nobleman went into a far country to receive kingly power and then return. Ultimately, Augustus confirmed Archelaus as Herod's principal successor. The territories of Judea, Samaria, and the family homeland of Idumea thus went to Archelaus. The territories of Galilee and Perea went to Antipas, and the northeasterly part of Herod's kingdom, Etruria and Trachonitis, went to Philip. Collectively, these brothers, like other members of the family, are known as the Herodians. Each of them is also called by the name Herod, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip, and each is mentioned in the New Testament. We meet Archelaus only briefly when the Holy Family is returning from their flight to Egypt. Matthew notes that Joseph rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth. Had it not been for Archelaus obtaining Judea, Josephus might have taken the Holy Family back to Bethlehem, at least for a time. He went instead to Galilee, which was ruled over by Antipas, perhaps indicating that Joseph thought Antipas was a less dangerous ruler than Archelaus. Archelaus definitely had a poor reputation as a ruler. Even before Augustus had confirmed his position, Archelaus had massacred 3,000 of his subjects in the temple at Passover, and so it goes, and he then canceled Passover. He made many enemies among his subjects, and eventually the Romans banished him to what is now France and assumed direct rule of Archelaus' territory. That's why, when Jesus is crucified, there's a Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, in charge in Judea rather than one of the Herodians. Joseph's judgment that it would be better to live under Herod Antipas than Archelaus may be reflected in the fact that when Jesus was an adult, Herod Antipas was still ruling Galilee. By comparison to his brother Archelaus, Antipas was a more stable and long-lasting ruler. Because he's ruling Galilee during Jesus' ministry, Herod Antipas is the family member about whom we hear the most in the Gospels, and often he's referred to simply as Herod. The Gospels portray him as a complex man. For a start, he had an unlawful marriage. At some point, he apparently stole Herodias, the wife of his brother Herod Philip, and married her. That put him in opposition to John the Baptist, who opposed the union, leading Herod to arrest John. Although he had John in custody, and although his wife hated John and wanted him dead, Herod Antipas served as John's protector and had an unusual fascination with the fiery preacher. Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. Eventually, after her daughter Salome delighted Antipas with a special dance at his birthday party, Herodias was able to manipulate him into giving the order for John's death. And so it goes. But this didn't end Antipas's fascination with John. When he began to hear reports about Jesus, he thought Jesus might be John raised from the dead, and he sought to see Jesus for himself. There are also indications that he sought to kill Jesus. At one point, some Pharisees seek to help Jesus by telling him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." In the end, Herod does get to see Jesus, for during the Passion narrative, Pontius Pilate sends the prisoner Jesus to see him. But when Jesus won't do a miracle for him, Herod mocks Jesus and sends him back. Although Antipas lasted longer than his brother Archelaus, he too ended up being exiled to France by the Romans after being accused of plotting against the emperor Caligula. We know less about Herod Philip than we do his brothers. In fact, there's some confusion in the historical sources about him. As the ruler of the most northeasterly part of Herod the Great's territories, Philip does not enter very much into the gospel accounts, as Jesus' ministry was not based in his territory. We do know that he was the first husband of Herodias before she married Herod Antipas, and it appears that he was the father of her daughter Salome, who performed the dance that led to John the Baptist's death. Eventually, the generation of Herod the Great's sons began to pass, and a new generation began to take their place. The key figure in this generation was Herod Agrippa, one of Herod the Great's grandsons. He was named after the Roman statesman and general Marcus Agrippa, who was a friend of Herod the Great and a colleague of Augustus. Herod Agrippa's father was Aristobulus, one of the sons that his grandfather had executed. Agrippa was educated at Rome and spent much time there. He was friends with both the emperors Caligula and Claudius, and played a pivotal role in helping stabilize Claudius in office after the dramatic assassination of Caligula by his own guards. And so it goes. A roguish and flamboyant figure, Herod Agrippa was sometimes down on his luck, but ultimately he rose to prominence and was even given the title king. He was the first to get that title since Herod the Great. He was also given territories that ultimately became larger than those of Herod the Great. He was a popular ruler in his own day, and he was sometimes referred to as Agrippa the Great. We meet him in Acts chapter 12, where he has James the son of Zebedee put to death, and so it goes, and he also attempts to have Peter killed as well. Agrippa met his own end, though, when at a public meeting with a delegation from Tyre and Sidon, he was acclaimed as a god and did not rebuke the flattery. He was immediately struck with a violent illness and died 5 days later, and so it goes. The Herodian Dynasty lasted one more generation in Judea. Its principal figure was the son of Herod Agrippa, who bore his father's name. He was Herod Agrippa II. He's referred to in Acts simply as Agrippa, and we meet him when he and his sister Bernice pay a welcome visit to the Roman governor Festus, who had St. Paul in custody. Agrippa takes an interest in Paul's case, and they have a hearing in which Paul speaks to Festus, Agrippa, and Bernice. During the hearing, St. Paul takes the opportunity to evangelize, and Agrippa responds, "In a short time you think to make me a Christian?" And Paul replies with the comedic line that he wishes all men would become as he is, except for these chains. After Paul has been sent to Rome, Agrippa and Bernice went on to play a major role in trying to prevent the Jewish war, which broke out in AD 66 and which led to the destruction of Herod the Great's temple in AD 70. Part of Agrippa's own territories revolted, and he struggled alongside the Roman forces in trying to put down the rebellion. Ultimately, they succeeded, and Agrippa was rewarded for his loyalty to Rome. Little is heard of him after that, though, and he, together with the Herodian Dynasty, vanishes into history. And so it goes. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. And you can also help me keep making the podcast. I do need your help with that. And you can get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you always.